Very glad to be with you this evening. And as Chris said, what I'd like to do is give you a presentation on Joseph Ratzinger's political theology. And really, what I hope to do is, through the lens of his political theology, give you a very preliminary synopsis of Ratzinger's overall thought and the project that flows from his thought. I thought I might do it through the lens of his political theology, because when we think about Ratzinger and his project, all the things that he got accomplished, we generally don't focus in on his political theology. In fact, a lot of folks, many of whom do read a fair bit of Ratzinger, don't appreciate the fact that political theology was a centrally important topic for Ratzinger from his young age all the way through to the end of his life, all the way through to the end of his pontificate, and then even after. So I thought, well, let's do that. Let's kill two birds with one stone. Let's get a sense of Ratzinger's overall project by going through the lens of his political theology. It's 7:19. I'll go for about 30 minutes or so, and then we can take some questions and answers. What I'll also do at the same time, as a third bird to kind of knock out of the sky, is give you some reading suggestions about where you might begin reading Ratzinger if you're going to go through the vein of his political theology and then get a sense of his general thought. So, because one or another of you might want to pick up Ratzinger after this talk, take a gander. And in the scope of his broad collections, you might wonder, well, where to begin? The place to begin is the following. It's a little essay. It's about 20 pages long in, I think, 18-point font. It's an appendix essay attached at the end of a little collection of homilies that Ratzinger delivered when he was Archbishop of Munich and Freising back in the late 70s, so 78, 79, before Pope John Paul II called him to Rome to assume the position of prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. In the course of Advent, Ratzinger delivered 4 homilies on Genesis, and through that lens, a broader presentation on how a believing Christian in the contemporary context seeks to engage Scripture with the advances of the historical critical method, etc. He will later attach this little essay as an appendix, and that is really the place to begin, in some respects, with Ratzinger's work. In those 20 pages, I have never read a more comprehensive and profound analysis of the whole scope of human thought, philosophy, and theology. Those 20 pages are a remarkable tour de force that Ratzinger engages in. It's quintessential Ratzinger. He makes it look very easy when in fact it's really, really hard. I highly encourage you to pick up those 20 pages. The little book is called In the Beginning. The English title is In the Beginning, and the appendix is attached at the end, of course. What does Ratzinger try to do in those 20 pages at the back of that book? What Ratzinger does is he presents, ultimately, the great conflict in the whole history of human thought. It's a conflict that pits what he's going to refer to as the creation perspective, the creation paradigm, matched up against the Gnostic paradigm. And at the end of the day, and underneath all the discussions and conflicts that take place in the course of human history, ultimately Ratzinger makes the case that we have to choose between the creation paradigm or the Gnostic paradigm. Here, it's important to take note that Ratzinger, from a young age, when he was a seminarian in the 1950s, remember that the young Ratzinger lived through the Second World War. He was involuntarily conscripted into the Nazi youth, was an unwilling conscript, and then was able to pursue his seminary studies. And in the early 1950s, he will have an occasion to read a series of lectures that were published in a book by an Austrian philosopher named Erich Voegelin. Voegelin was a Lutheran, a very accomplished philosopher, had been an opponent of Nazism. And in the post-war years, Voegelin had been invited to the University of Chicago to deliver the annual Walgreen Lectures. And those lectures, delivered in English, were collected in a little volume called The New Science of Politics. It's an extraordinary book, absolutely masterful. And it had a tremendous impact on the young Ratzinger, so much so that we have a letter in which Ratzinger describes to Voegelin the impact that this book had on him. So the young Ratzinger takes time to write to Voegelin to thank him for the book and stress how significant an influence it was on him. The influence of Voegelin can be traced all the way through Ratzinger's thought. In this particular frame, highlighted here in this little appendix essay that I've cited, Eric Voegelin, in these Walgreen lectures published in The New Science of Politics, presents an analysis, a sweeping, penetrating analysis of the great history of all ages, namely the heresy of Gnosticism. Voegelin is going to do a masterful job of showing how Gnosticism has traced its way through the centuries and in so doing morphed to a certain extent while remaining the same. Voegelin will contrast classic Gnosticism with modern Gnosticism. What is Gnosticism? Voegelin's analysis of it that Ratzinger picks up. Gnosticism is the heresy, it's the current of thought that maintains that reality is fundamentally chaotic. Reality, the cosmos, is fundamentally disordered. There is no inherent order, therefore no inherent intelligibility, therefore no inherent purposefulness to the cosmos. The cosmos is chaotic, it's fundamentally disordered, it has no inherent teleology, it has no inherent direction, inbuilt purposefulness. And therefore, the cosmos, reality, is fundamentally dangerous. The cosmos is dangerous, and the goal of life, the goal of an individual's life, is to escape the chaos, to flee from the violence in order to find security. In the classic expression of Gnosticism, the way to do this is to escape beyond the seventh heavens and to reach the sphere, the zone beyond. That's the classic form of Gnosticism that would have traced its way through the ancient world. What Voegelin does, what no one had done until Voegelin, it's a remarkable, remarkable tour de force in that series of lectures. What Voegelin does is show how the Gnostic current is going to morph in the modern age while remaining fundamentally the same in its identity. And for Voegelin, this is the key to understanding what distinguishes the modern era from the pre-modern classical Judeo-Christian era. Critically important for Voegelin, and by extension for Ratzinger, and by extension for us, because I think Voegelin and Ratzinger have it right, and in the measure that we get this, so much else will fall into place, not only with respect to our understanding of Ratzinger's thought and his overall project, but with respect to what's going on around us, our place in this world as Christians who are trying to get our bearings, and what we can do in the public civil order. Voegelin's analysis suggests the following: that what happens in the modern era, what denotes the modern era, is now an effort to immanentize, to bring down to earth the effort to establish order and peace out of the chaos. The modern form of Gnosticism maintains the fundamental conviction that the cosmos is inherently chaotic, disordered, purposeless, and therefore violent. But the modern strain of Gnosticism suggests that the solution is not so much to escape beyond the seventh heavens, but rather to remake the world below, to remake the world here, this ordo. We will refashion the world, and we will bring order out of disorder, peace out of violence. That is modern Gnosticism. And when we say that it is an immanentist current, what we mean is that immanentist is to bring it down here below, rather than to escape beyond the seventh heavens. Modern Gnosticism seeks to bring the ideal down here by refashioning the chaos into an order that corresponds to what we have thought of, what we have envisioned. Critically important. The way you do that, of course, is going to be through some political project. Absolutely critical to understand that. Ratzinger, several decades later, in this little appendix essay, is therefore going to say there are two fundamental paradigms, and you have to choose between one or the other. This is the ground level. You don't get below this, right? So you always may be thinking like, well, how low do the philosophers go? And there's always another layer. No. Ratzinger's done the work for you. This is the brass tacks. This is the ground floor. The Gnostic paradigm and the creation paradigm. Talked a little bit about the Gnostic paradigm. Let's talk a little bit about the creation paradigm. Then what we're going to do is look at how Ratzinger analyzes the shift and the progress towards modern Gnosticism. But before we get into that, because that gets us into the weeds a little bit, let's talk a little bit about what Ratzinger means by the creation paradigm. The creation paradigm is the classical Judeo-Christian paradigm, and it maintains that the cosmos, reality, creation, is inherently ordered. It is not chaotic. It is inherently ordered. It is inherently intelligible, which means susceptible to being understood, that the mind can match up with the order in the thing. And it is inherently purposeful. It is not accidental or random or what have you. The cosmos, creation, is inherently purposeful. This is hugely important and radically different than what the Gnostic paradigm presents. The Gnostic paradigm is chaos and disorder and violence, and the creation paradigm is order, purposefulness, and therefore peace, life. These two paradigms will therefore suggest two very different postures for us to adopt, and from the postures, different projects. If Eric Voegelin was a very important influence on Ratzinger, so was another thinker of his era named Joseph Pieper. Pieper was German, not Austrian. He was Catholic, not Lutheran. But his analysis, his philosophical perspective, was in many ways in sync with Voegelin's. Pieper's intellectual project was a little different than Voegelin's. Pieper was not fundamentally a political philosopher the way that Voegelin was, but Pieper's philosophical project does overlay, in some important respects, rather nicely on top of Voegelin's. And Ratzinger will be deeply influenced by the work of Joseph Pieper, the work and the life of Joseph Pieper. One of Pieper's most important little books, the one that I often tell people to begin with, this is the book that I used to teach when I was a high school teacher as a Jesuit regent in Sacramento. I'd have the boys read Pieper's little book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. It's an extraordinary little book, highly recommended to you. And that book, like Pieper's wider project, exercised an important influence on Ratzinger. Among other things, in that little book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, Pieper will present two contrasting postures, two contrasting visions. Kind of resonates with what we were just talking about. In the first phase, we talked about Gnostic versus creation. Well, now Pieper is also talking about two paradigms and two postures. He's going to, because he's coming at it from an epistemological, that is to say, a knowledge. Epistemology is the study of how we know things. So Pieper's coming at his analysis here from the lens of how we know things, the posture of knowing. Pieper is going to present two postures. The posture that is characteristic of the Gnostic framework, paradigm, is the posture of ratio. The ratio posture, as Pieper maintains, is the posture by which my orientation towards the cosmos is not so much one of receiving and adopting or conforming my mind and my life to the order that I see inherent in the cosmos, but rather to gain knowledge from the cosmos, about the cosmos, that will then translate into a power with which I can remake the cosmos. I can remake the world as I see fit. That's the ratio posture. It's a very, let's say, aggressive, forward-leaning sort of posture. And that's the posture characteristic of the Gnostic project. On the other hand, Pieper, in that little book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, will present a different posture, the one of intellectus. This is the posture that Pieper buys into, obviously, and this is the posture that overlays into the creation paradigm. The intellectus posture is premised on this conviction that my obligation is to receive, open my mind, open my spirit to the order that is inherent in the cosmos around me and in my nature, to receive it so that I can conform my mind and my life to that order. My purpose is not to remake the order. My purpose is to conform my mind and life more fully to the order that is already there. Because the order has been placed there by someone else already. And that someone else is God. The creation paradigm and the intellectus posture that is characteristic of the creation paradigm rests on the conviction that God exists and that God in himself is ordered, wisdom, goodness. And because like can only bring forth like, God's creation bears his thumbprint, if you will, which means that God's creation also has order and intelligibility and purposefulness in it. The good God brings forth an inherently good creation for a good purpose, for a good end. And therefore the posture that I am to adopt vis-a-vis this framework is not one of aggressive defensive hostility, which expresses itself in a need to remake and reshape so as to find security, but rather to allow myself to be, so to speak, penetrated by, filled by enchanted by the order that I see, that I behold, that I'm privileged to see before me. This is where the ancient Greek philosophical tradition had its first great intuitions. We see this in Plato, we see this in Aristotle. Who is the philosopher? Who is the man fully alive? He's the one whose spirit is captivated, enchanted by the beauty of the world around him, a beauty which is expressive of the order, the harmonious order that he sees all around him in the cosmos, which is purposeful. That's the disposition of the philosopher. He is enchanted. And this is where eros love finds one of its expressions and places. Eros love is a love of enchantment that draws me out of myself and towards the beautiful, towards the lovable. That's the classical posture of the ancient philosopher that the Judeo-Christian tradition will, if you will, baptize, take to itself, and fill out in dramatic fashion in light of the gospel. So we have Ratzinger, having read Voegelin. Voegelin was strictly, especially a political philosopher. We have Ratzinger reading Pieper. Pieper was a metaphysician and ethicist. Tremendous man, also an opponent of the Nazi regime. Ratzinger, in his great synthetic mind, is pulling the strands out from these thinkers and others, Augustine, etc., of course, and he's beginning to form his own synthetic view of it. And what's marvelous about Ratzinger is he's able to take what is good in what these guys are doing, and then he takes it to the next level. Ratzinger was an extraordinary intellect. Don't be fooled by what comes off as a simple presentation. Ratzinger will make 6 moves, 6 jujitsu moves in one sentence and make it look easy. It's incredibly hard to do what Ratzinger did. How did we get here? And what do we do about it? Let's get into that. Part 2 is, how do we get here? And then part 3 will be, so what do we do? Let's talk a little bit about how we got here, the transition between classic Gnosticism and modern Gnosticism. Here, if you want to get a sense of how Ratzinger breaks it down, the genealogy of this development, I recommend that you take up his book, Introduction to Christianity, which is really the book that made him famous, or began to make him famous in the way that, bigwig theologians can be famous. Introduction to Christianity is really a class. In the European university world, there is a standard practice. It doesn't exist in the American university world so much, but it's still present in the European model. It's not uncommon in the European model for the best of professors to teach a class, and often enough teach it many times. And what they do is, in the European context, often they read their lectures. I know it strikes us as very odd in the American framework. You're like, why don't you just give me the lecture and I'll read it at home rather than come here and listen to you read it 3 times slower than what I would read it at home. That's how they do things. Less so nowadays, but very much so still when Ratzinger was a professor, in this case at the University of Tübingen, 1968, 67, 68. Ratzinger is giving this course on fundamental theology. Fundamental theology is a discipline in theology where you try to engage and intersect the deposit of the Christian faith with contemporary currents of thought. Ratzinger, in a lot of ways, was a fundamental theologian. It was his passion. He loved fundamental theology. And here he has all these young German university students in Tübingen in 1968 and they're all going crazy and rebelling. And he, Ratzinger, says, I'm going to present a fresh, new take on the creed, on the Christian gospel, in such a way as to try to make it intersect with the prominent thinkers, currents of thought of our day and age, the kind of folks that these kids will be influenced by, among them Karl Marx and others. I recommend that you pick up Introduction to Christianity, read the whole thing, of course, but first, see if you can do a real good read and study of the first 80 pages, 90 pages or so. And what you'll see there is Ratzinger give his first comprehensive crack at trying to present a history or genealogy of the development of Western thought that leads to this modern version of Gnosticism. Remember, the modern version of Gnosticism is the effort to immanentize the remaking of things, immanentize the project of establishing order. Ratzinger will pick out several key figures, figures that he thinks are key in this history. I'll just cite a couple of them. One of them is going to be Galileo Galilei. Galileo was born in 1564. He's going to die in 1642. And in Ratzinger's estimation, Galileo is one of the critical central figures, unwitting in a lot of ways, critically central figures in making this very dramatic shift. Galileo is going to grow up, he's from northern Italy, and he, at the outset, wants to be a doctor. And so he's going to go to the university, and in his medical classes, he begins to realize that his professors, for example, in anatomy class, their teaching does not correspond with the reality before them. So Galileo has this striking experience of being in an anatomy class. There's a cadaver in front of him, and the professor, being what we would call kind of a crusty Aristotelian, the professor who has spent all of his life reading Aristotle and commentaries on Aristotle is talking about how the nervous system works a certain way. But then Galileo is looking at the cadaver and he says, well, no, what we see before us suggests that the nervous system works like this. But this professor and others, these late scholastic era professors, could not get their minds wrapped around and do precisely what Aristotle would have encouraged them to do, which is to study the thing in front of them and to let it reveal to them the truth about what they are. No, these late scholastic, crusty Aristotelians were just completely paralyzed by the books, by Aristotle and the commentaries, the commentatorial tradition. So Galileo says, to heck with this. And he says, this is not the way to go. We have a huge problem. Galileo, therefore, embarks on a lifelong project to launch a whole new way of doing science. And in Galileo's project, what he comes to is the conviction that what we need is a new way to get precise knowledge of things. And that with this precise knowledge, we'll be able to make things better. And so Galileo, in very basic terms, sets out and says, well, biology needs to be subsumed to chemistry, chemistry needs to be subsumed to mathematics, mathematics to geometry. Because through mathematics, and especially geometry, and here the bit about geometry, it'll be René Descartes. He's the one who's going to take that step in a very big way towards geometry. Descartes was very, very much impressed by Galileo. So Galileo, as I said, lives from 1564 to 1642. Descartes is born in 1596 and dies in 1650. So Descartes is a young kid in the Jesuit high school, and he's learning about Galileo's discoveries and projects as a young high school kid. And that's going to set the course for all of Descartes' life. So Descartes is going to extend the Galileo project. In any event, back to Galileo. Galileo says we need to reduce the sciences, biology to chemistry, chemistry to physics, physics to math. Because math is a precise science. And with the precise science, we can get precise knowledge. And with the precise knowledge, we can remake the world. Why? Because the world is a mess in a lot of ways. And we have an ability now to, Galileo will use very harsh terminology here, violate the world. We will take her secrets from her so that we can remake her. Here, Galileo is echoing a current of thought that is developing in England with Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon is going to make the case to the king, King James, been King James VI of Scotland, becomes King James I in England after Elizabeth dies. And he's going to tell the king, we have an opportunity to establish a new science, a new organon, because the monks, and by extension the Christian church, have kept us enslaved and in the muck for far too long. They have had us focus on heaven to the neglect of our earthly condition. And our opportunity now, having gotten rid of the monks, remember that Henry VIII had abolished the monasteries, sacked the monasteries, and England has become Protestant, project that was furthered under Elizabeth I, and now we're under James I, Elizabeth's successor. Now there's an opportunity to do what the monks would never have let us do, which is to establish a new way of doing science, to heck with the old Aristotelians who don't know what they're doing, a la Galileo. Galileo had the same intuition. And we're going to establish a new way of doing real science that will allow us to remake the world. Science for knowledge that leads to the power that allows us to remake things, to improve man's state here below. That's Francis Bacon speaking to King James I. Galileo's got something similar in mind, although Galileo was a very devout Catholic, didn't intend to put Christianity to the side or the church to the side. Interestingly, Galileo, in his project, had said, we need to subject everything to mathematics except anthropology, except human nature, because human beings are not subject to this mathematical study. But then, of course, Descartes and his successors are just going to blow right through that stop sign and are going to say, no, we need to mathematize everything. Bacon to Hobbes, Galileo to Descartes. So this is where, according to Ratzinger, we see the consequential turn towards the modern. We now see a new attitudinal posture by which our objective is no longer to receive the order of the world and conform our lives to it, but rather to plunder the world so as to remake it according to our own image. This will be in part motivated by precisely the Protestant Reformation and then the wars of religion, which will lead to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, where the goal of political accord now is to try to find peace so that the warring parties stop killing each other, Protestants and Catholics. Ratzinger's analysis then goes forward, and he will focus on some other important figures there in that first section of Introduction to Christianity. He will make important mention of the role of history and how in this new Gnostic modern paradigm, history no longer has a valued place because we're not supposed to be subject to the lessons of the past and to the wisdom handed down from all the ages. We are making the world anew. And what is real and historical is what we will make with our hands The new true, the new factum is going to be what we make with our hands. So the past and history and tradition get put to the side. For Ratzinger, this is what lays the groundwork for totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, all the totalitarian projects of the 20th century. And this is where we get into Ratzinger's explicitly theological reflections on the movement of political currents and on the consequences of modern Gnosticism. Here, I think Ratzinger has done something that no one else has done in his specifically theological reflections. Ratzinger, in the course of his life work, is going to, meditating on these questions, draw more and more, or hone in more and more and more on the central role of the theological virtue of hope. And when it comes to what Ratzinger prescribes for the Christian in the contemporary context, the way for us to understand it is through the frame of Ratzinger's meditations on theological hope, the supernatural virtue of hope. This is what Ratzinger is getting at. The totalitarian regimes of the 20th century have come about and wreaked the havoc that they have, in part because God has made the human heart for the heavenly Jerusalem, for eternity. And only God can establish the heavenly Jerusalem. Only God can satisfy the deepest desires of the human heart, the desire that God himself has planted in the human heart. As a result, all of the efforts in modern society, modern times, to immanentize the kingdom, that is to say, to establish here below the city of God as the city of man, all of these projects are doomed to failure because man cannot give himself what only God can provide. And as a result, modern Gnostic political projects, the totalitarian projects, get caught in this vicious circle by which they have to try to deliver on an undeliverable promise. And in every way that they fail, they have to redouble their efforts at trying to deliver the undeliverable. And the bet, or the wager, or the deal, rather, the deal that is struck is the more freedom you surrender to the state, to the political project, the more the state will be able to satisfy this deepest desire of yours. Give me only a little bit more of your freedom, and I will deliver satisfying results. But it never works because we live in a fallen world and we are creatures who cannot deliver eternal life. That's Ratzinger's analysis of the modern Gnostic political projects. Hence, for Ratzinger, it is absolutely imperative that Christians in the public order, right, because Christians have a role to play in the public order, the witness to be given is a witness to theological hope in the grounded conviction that God exists, God created, God has redeemed and saved, and God will fulfill his promises, as he always does, in establishing the heavenly Jerusalem. And so the desires of the human heart are not in vain. Life is not fundamentally fatalistic, but rather the desire is, I would say, the sign of the promise to be fulfilled in the heavenly Jerusalem. And therefore, Christians have to bear witness to our primary citizenship, which is in the heavenly Jerusalem. This is, in some respects, especially important for Americans because we live in a fundamentally Protestant country, and the political experiment and the political strains in this country can sometimes suggest that America is the promised land, that America is the beacon of light on a hill in a very expansive sense. And there are strong political currents in America, historically and even today, that seem to lean heavily in the direction of supposing and suggesting that America is the be-all and end-all, the promised land, that America is really the city of God. And Ratzinger, echoing Augustine, would say, no. The American project, in Ratzinger's estimation, is in many respects a highly commendable political project, commendable in ways that no other political project in history has been. But that having been said, America is not the promised land. It's not the city of God. Here he's echoing Augustine's reflections in the wake of the sack of Rome. Remember that Rome is sacked in 410. And then Augustine sets about from 412 to about 427 to write his great work, De Civitas Dei, the city of God. And in that work and elsewhere, Augustine makes the strong case that Rome is not the city of God, and the emperor is not Christ. Augustine's thought was hugely influential in the Western Church, pushing back against the strong current of Eusebius of Caesarea, who had been the court historian for Constantine, who was going to be the inventor of this notion of Caesaro-papism, that the empire is God's instantiation of the city of God, and the emperor really is, in many respects, Christ actuating the city of God here below. Augustine will push very strongly against that current of thought, I think wisely so. And Augustine's political thought will trace its way through history, and Ratzinger has read his Augustine very well. And he has said, in the context of the modern totalitarian regimes, it's important for us to remember what Augustine tried to teach us. The city of God is God's project, and the king of the city of God is Christ the King. But it's precisely in being fundamentally committed to the city of God, to the heavenly Jerusalem, Ratzinger says, grounded in the theological virtue of supernatural hope, the theological virtue of hope. It's precisely in grounding my citizenship in the city of God that I become an ever more fruitful citizen of my earthly city. See, this is the thing, Ratzinger says, that Bacon, Francis Bacon, and all the moderns don't understand. In the measure that I am grounded in the city of God, in the heavenly Jerusalem, I'm actually a far more productive citizen of the earthly city, because I do not need to instrumentalize the earthly city to make it give me something it can never give me. But in the measure that I am not fundamentally a citizen of the city of God, but fundamentally a citizen of the earthly city, and therefore trying to make the earthly city into the heavenly city here below, that I am actually the worst kind of citizen, because I am destined to tear this earthly city asunder, rather than building it up in the way that it can be built up. And so the monks of the medieval era were not agents of obstruction to the improvement of man's condition here below, but precisely insofar as they were pointing to the heavenly Jerusalem, they were rendering an invaluable service to the city of man below. Ratzinger says, this is the witness that Christians, Catholics, need to bear today, give today. A witness to the reality of the heavenly Jerusalem and to God's fulfillment of his promises, to the point, Ratzinger says, of being willing to shed blood. That we shall not serve mammon. We shall not give our lives over to totalitarian gnostic political projects. And it may cost us our lives, but in doing that, we actually are rendering greater service to the city here below, to our country, whether it be the United States or wherever. We are actually rendering better service to the United States than those who would like to transform the United States or any other nation, any other state, into a pseudo-city of God. So let us give thanks to our Lord for the great witness of Joseph Ratzinger, his extraordinary contribution to the intellectual patrimony of the 20th century, and let us pray for the grace to take his call seriously and integrate it into the course of our lives, day to day, in little ways, and maybe in bigger ways, should God call us to that. Thank you very much.